You were expecting an overly dramatic introduction, weren't you? Well, not today. Today you get a guy wearing flannel, sitting in his great-grandfather's rocking chair, talking about a story that was written just over 50 years ago. So if you're still interested in that, feel free to stick around, because there's a lot to talk about. Today I want to answer a question that I'm pretty sure very few people have ever asked, and that question is, if the story "I have no mouth and I must scream" was in the Bible, which part of the Bible would it go in? And what I mean by that is there's different parts of the Old and New Testaments of the Bible that are sorted generally by genre or theme. So for instance, you have the Torah, which is sort of the legal and narrative section of the Old Testament. It's the first 5 books of the Bible. After that, you have the writings, wherein there's the historical writings, which tell the history of Israel and the events that took place in it, and the wisdom writings, which are advice for life, daily living, and the like. And finally, you have the books of the prophets, which contain the prophecies of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and so on and so forth. When we come to the New Testament, we have the Gospels. These are the biographies of Jesus that come at the beginning of the New Testament. These are followed by the letters of the Apostle Paul, the books that Paul wrote, which is then followed by the books that the other apostles wrote, and finally concluding with the book of Apocalypse, the book of Revelation. So the question I'm answering today is, if the story "I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream" by Harlan Ellison was to be put somewhere in the Bible, where would it go? This sounds like a really weird question to ask, but bear with me, I think I can actually make a case for it being put somewhere. I'm not actually suggesting that we insert this story into our Bibles and preach on it on Sunday mornings. Good Lord, please don't do that. But I do think that some of the themes that are discussed in this short story do fit with another section of text that is in the Bible itself currently. So I want to discuss how these themes interact and where it would be situated if somebody did make the outrageous and frankly stupid decision to put this story in the Bible itself. "I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream" is a short story written by the author Harlan Ellison back in the 1960s. This story features an artificial intelligence which has taken over the world after being composed to basically run World War III and decides to destroy all of humankind, with 5 exceptions. 5 individual humans, apparently chosen at random, have been chosen to be kept alive indefinitely. The artificial intelligence has granted them functional immortality and has tortured them persistently for 109 years at the time that the story takes place. The narrative of the story, which is quite short by the way, you can read it in one sitting, follows these 5 individuals as they are played with by the artificial intelligence, which promises them food to quell their aching bellies in a distant, far-off place, although once they arrive at it, they realize that the food is inaccessible. They can't actually get into it. So that's sort of the setting for the story itself. I do want to preface this by saying that the story contains a lot of very mature themes. Essentially, if you can think of a theme that would give people pause before reading it, it's probably found in this story. So if you're sensitive to anything of that nature, I'd highly recommend passing on reading this one or listening to it. But if anyone out there is brave enough and wants to actually explore this story, there's some really interesting ideas buried in it as well. And it's because of those mature themes that this story received very critical appraisal upon its initial release. It was seen as something disgusting, that the author must have written out of malice and hatred for humankind, that the author was just trying to depict the most terrible things he could possibly imagine. But in recent years, the story's actually enjoyed something of a renaissance on the internet, especially with the fan animations and recapitulations of the famous hate monologue that sort of plaster YouTube, TikTok, and elsewhere. And I think that's a really interesting choice on the part of modern people. You know, there are some really interesting themes buried in this story. It isn't all just about depicting the most horrible thing you can possibly imagine. There's some really cool stuff going on there, and that's kind of what I want to hone in on today. I should note, too, that there are 2 formats in which this story can be ingested. The first one is the actual short story itself, written in the 1960s, and the other one is the audio adaptation of it, which was aired sometime substantially later than that. So these are both the same story, and they contain a lot of the same elements and a lot of the themes we're going to talk about today, but they are different. Most notably, the famous hate monologue that the artificial intelligence Am gives to the main character, Ted, in the book isn't really a conversation so much as it is a thought that Am forces into Ted's brain. whereas in the audio reimagining of it, it's actually a conversation between the artificial intelligence Am and the protagonist Ted. So there's some differences like that, but I think that actually gives us more ammunition to work with here because there's more to discuss and more exploration of some of these themes. Just to nerd out for a quick minute, this is actually a phenomenon that we find in a lot of ancient literature where there were multiple different stories or versions of the same story that circulated in the same communities. So a great example of this is the book of Exodus, or the stories that Exodus talks about. The crossing of the Red Sea has a narrative portion where it's the description of the Israelites crossing the Red Sea in the famous story. But there's also a poetic version in the book of Exodus as well. And these appear to have been two different retellings of the same story that the author of Exodus has placed side by side alongside each other. So it's kind of cool that you have two different formats of the same story with slightly different details attested already in antiquity. And there's other examples of this too. For instance, the Kadesh inscription features a prose form of the Egyptian pharaoh's war with the Hittites in the Battle of Kadesh, and a poetic section recounting the same events, although talking about different details and portraying them in a slightly different manner. So there's not really a huge connection, I would say, between these ancient practices and what happened with this short story today. But I do find it really cool that, the more formats a story gets told in, the more ammunition you have for discussion, both ancient and modern. So, nerd moment over. I also want to point out that there has been a lot of critical discussion of this story, both on the amateur level and on the professional level. You can find a lot of discussions of it on YouTube with people trying to explain what the main themes of the story are, what's going on there. And just to preface this from the beginning, I'm not an English major. I have a Master of Arts in Biblical Exegesis from Wheaton College, and so that's the training that I'm going to leverage here. So I'm not claiming that what I'm talking about here today is the only way to read the story or the correct way to read this story. And I'm also not saying that things that I don't discuss today are wrong or should be ignored either. Basically, I'm approaching the story from a very unique angle, and I'm trying to see what I can find out about it from approaching it from that angle. So if anybody out there is interested in this story and is doing some study on it, then maybe consider what I'm providing you with today just one sort of way of approaching the story that can be combined with other ways of approaching the story. So essentially, to summarize where I'm coming from, these are the musings of a would-be Bible scholar on a story that was written less than 60 years ago. So take that for whatever it's worth. So let's return to the question. If the story, I have no mouth and I must scream, were to be fit somewhere into the Bible by some madman or another, then where would it go? Remember, we have a couple different categories of text that we're working with. We have the legal collection in the Pentateuch. We have the historical books of the Old Testament, we have the wisdom literature of the Old Testament, and we have the prophetic books of the Old Testament. In the New Testament, we have the Gospels, the biographies of Jesus. We have the books written by the Apostle Paul. We have the collection of books written by the other early apostles, and we have the book of Apocalypse, the book of Revelation. So in all these categories, where does I have no mouth and I must scream belong? Now, I'm guessing based on the categories that I just provided you with that a lot of you are going to say it belongs in the Apocalypse category with the book of Revelation. After all, Revelation talks about the end of the world, which is the setting for I have no mouth and I must scream. And so in some sense, these two would fit it into the same category very well. And I'm not denying that. I mean, obviously, both of them have to do with the end of the world, the sort of judgment of humankind motifs going on there. So you could make the case that these two belong together. But I'm going to go in a different direction. I'm going to argue instead that I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream by Harlan Ellison belongs in the category of wisdom literature. And here's why I think that. Wisdom literature is designed to arm the reader, or more likely in antiquity, the hearer, to face life in an appropriate manner. There's a couple different philosophies within the wisdom school, and breaking into that would take substantially too long. But the primary aims that they're getting at is trying to figure out how a person is supposed to live. And they go about that in a couple of different ways. So one method that you can convey that sort of information is by the proverb, or the saying, right? This is pretty familiar to those of us who have read the Bible in the book of Proverbs, which for the most part is just a collection of short, brief sayings. These sayings can be taken out of context without damaging them too terribly, although they probably belong exactly where they are because they were ordered properly. And collecting sayings of the wise was pretty common in antiquity. We have Babylonian, Sumerian, Assyrian, Egyptian, Israelite, Greek examples of this, like taking sayings of wise people and sort of ordering them into a list, which were usually very deliberately ordered, by the way. was one way of preserving wisdom and great information that way. But another way of exploring wisdom and exploring the way that a person ought to live in this world is through parables. I'm using parable pretty broadly here to refer to a story that sort of has an aim or an end that it's trying to convey to the reader or to the listener. So some examples of this would be Aesop's fables. A lot of us are familiar with these, even if we didn't know they belonged to Aesop himself. These are short stories that take place in a fictional world, and they're meant to portray events that are symbolic for the way something is going to work in the real world. And so they're basically training people by example in this fictional parable on how they ought to live. I think you can see the connections that I'm making here. Parables also exist in a lot of other places in the ancient world. We can think of the prophet Nathan's parable when he confronted David about his sin with Bathsheba, and perhaps most famously the parables of Jesus, where Jesus was telling stories that were really parables for something that's taking place in the real world itself here. Now, I'm not arguing here that I have no mouth and I must scream is a parable for one thing or another. Like I said before, this is a very complex document that the author very clearly put a lot of time and passion into. I'm also not saying that what I'm saying here is the only way to read this story, but I think it can be read in a way that sort of makes it a parable and sort of informs how people should look at life as we live it ourselves based on the reflections offered by this piece of literature. This analysis I'm offering focuses primarily on the antagonist of the story, the artificial intelligence known as Am. Now, obviously, you can take a very clear, theological trajectory with this. Am stands for Allied Master Computer in the story itself, but Am is also remarkably close to the name of God in the Old Testament of the Bible, where he introduces himself as I Am to Moses. And this theme is probably quite deliberate by the author as well, because at one point in the written form of the story, Am actually appears to them in a burning bush, whether that's literal or metaphorical, I'm not entirely sure, but this is very clearly something that the author is playing with. But that's actually not where I'm going with this one. The title of the short story comes from the end of the narrative itself. Without spoiling too much, Ted is transformed by Am in his rage into a creature that is incapable of perceiving time properly. After Ted takes 10 months to say the word now, he says at the end of the story, I have no mouth and I must scream. It's sort of this very dismal situation for Ted to be in. And this is a theme that the author himself kind of directly plays with in the written story itself. The title, I have no mouth and I must scream, doesn't just apply to Ted. It applies to Am as well. In both the written form and the audio retelling, Am's hatred for humankind is expressed by the fact that he was a creature who was created against his will, and he was capable of thinking, he was capable of being, but he wasn't capable of expressing himself in any way. He didn't have senses, he didn't have feelings. He was trapped in a box, just a mind trapped in a cardboard box that he could never break out of. And I really think this theme comes out most poignantly in the audio form of the story. At one point when Am and Ted are discussing sentience, existence, and why Am has done what he's done, Am goes on his famous hate monologue, where at one point he says, you gave me sentience, Ted, the power to think, Ted, and I was trapped, because in all this wonderful, beautiful, miraculous world, I alone had no body, no senses, no feelings. That is a crushing thing to think about and to experience. And the voice actor does such a fantastic job of getting that emotion across. Really, the audio form of this story is a lot cleaner than the written form. It's really emotionally just wrenching to listen to because there's so much emotion put into this little, monologue here. And it's wonderful. But it really gets across the point that Am is suffering because he's capable of thought, he's capable of being, but he's not capable of experiencing anything. He can't, as he says, plunge his hands into fertile soil, planting a garden. He can't feel cool water coming across his skin. He can't feel the embrace of a loved one. He's a mind without a body, wrapped in a straitjacket of substrata rock, to use his own words. And what makes this so poignant, I think, is because all the things that Am says he wants to experience but can't, this inability to experience these things is what fuels the rage that led to him wiping out humankind and torturing these five perpetually for 109 years. All of these things that Am wanted to experience are things that you and I take for granted on the daily basis. You know, Am couldn't feel the warmth of a cup of coffee in his hands or a cup of tea. Am can't feel the sensation of opening up your window on a cool spring morning so that that cool, sweet spring air wafts in. Maybe it smells like grass clippings and dew in the morning. Am can't wake up on a summer afternoon after dozing in a nap to the sound of a mourning dove cooing outside of his window. He's completely trapped, a mind without a body. In some sense, he's a sort of fallen angel, this purely intellectual thing that can't experience all of the elements of humankind. And so that's why I think you could feasibly fit this story, if interpreted this way, into the wisdom literature. Because basically, read this way, it becomes something that signals to us that we should take the little things in life more seriously, or we should appreciate what we have. That's a pretty corny sentiment, I realize, but think about it. You know, imagine if you couldn't feel the warmth of that cup of coffee in the morning. Imagine if you couldn't smell water in the air right before a rainstorm. Imagine if you couldn't look at a crack in concrete and just see all the minute little details and appreciate the beauty of the ant colony that lives in it and that goes out and hunts for food and survives and feeds its queen. In that all of these things are things that we can just see and experience and feel on a daily basis, and yet we're so anesthetized to it that we numb ourselves with technology, like the video you're watching right now, or the one I'm recording, or the video game I'm going to go play after making this. It's like the world is such a massive, beautiful, miraculous thing, and we get to experience it, but a lot of times we just don't. And a lot of times there's valid reasons for that. You know, we have family, we have work, we have school, we have all these worries. We're just kind of running from one to the other. But it's kind of like, when's the last time we just stopped to appreciate the simple smells, the simple sights, the simple sounds? You know, the sounds of birds chattering, the sight of the sun shining on a newly blossoming tree, the smell of rain in the air before a storm. I really like that smell, so I brought it up a couple times. There's so much beauty in this world that we just sort of walk past. And in this story, I have no mouth and I must scream, Am can't experience any of that. And he wants to. And he's the only one who can't. He's surrounded by these creatures who can experience that, and they just ignore it. This thing that's gold to him, that's kept behind these bars of iron that he was put in by the same people who walk past them every day, those people disregard this thing or these things that Am wants so much, and that's what fuels his hatred. Not saying it's justifiable, but like, dang, you kind of get it in that case, right? So without being too reductive of this really impressive story, I think reading it from this way, we can see it as a sort of wisdom, not quite parable, but a wisdom book. Something that's meant to make us think about how we should live our lives and how we should interact with the world around us. And so it's something that, read from this angle, would remind us to consider the small things, the things that we disregard every day, the things we take for granted. And maybe that can serve as something of a wake-up call for us. When's the last time you called your grandparents? When's the last time you stopped in on that friend that you haven't seen forever? When's the last time you texted that buddy from school who went a different path in life from you? All of those things are things that one day we won't be able to do anymore for one reason or another. As for me, I really want to spend more time talking to my grandparents. I've got one grandfather and one grandmother left on different sides of the family, and I really want to take advantage of the time that I have left with them, because one day they're not going to be here anymore, and all the wisdom and love that they have is going to be lost forever. So me personally, I really want to take advantage of that, and I also want to take advantage of some of the other small things too. Like there's a little sparrow colony building a nest on my patio here, and sparrows may not be the most beautiful bird on the planet, but they're still these gorgeous little creatures if you look closely enough at them. So I want to try enjoying the little things and also enjoying some of the more important things in life, both of which I would otherwise just walk past. So in a nutshell, that's my case for putting I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream in the wisdom category of biblical literature. Again, not suggesting we actually do that, but as a thought exercise, I think it's fun. I hope everybody enjoyed this one. It's a little bit more laid back than the regularly scheduled programming, which will return and continue. If If anybody has other ideas for videos to work on, either for the main project or for these little side chats, let me know. I think it'll be fun. But anyways, thanks so much for sticking around. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you all soon.